Hello everyone, my name is Ben. Most of you probably know me as Zistrol, and most of you watching probably know me for talking a lot about card games. Well, today I like to talk about something that isn't card games. I like to talk about books. So a little bit of backstory, about a year, or just over a year ago, I changed careers, I moved out of the tech sector, and I started working at a bookstore. And ever since I was a kid, I really enjoyed reading. And when I got a bit older and got into university, for some reason, reasons unbeknown to me still, stopped reading altogether and just began pursuing other hobbies like video games, trading card games, etc. And even though the pay was worse and the hours aren't great, I have less control of my schedule, I will say that I'm a lot happier with my life. Like, I'm earning enough to get by, to go on holiday, to buy cards, which, as we all know, are expensive. So, the fact that it's better for my mental health and I'm just enjoying the work I do is way better for me overall. And in this video, I'd like to wrap up what has been an at best tumultuous year by spending like 20 to 30 minutes yapping about the books I've enjoyed this year, especially considering that this has been my first year as a bookseller, my first year back to reading full time. And I just want to go over the books I've read in 2024 that have really like made an impact with me, and I just like to share some of the love I have for this pastime, this job, everything about it with someone that's willing to listen. So, without further ado, I decided to create this video also to mix up, like my love of card games, video production, and showcase my top eight, as we all know, as a tournament term. Of course, they are presented in order from eighth to first, in order of like how much they impacted me and how much I enjoyed them. But as we all know, as a card game players in top eight, anyone can win. So we'll see how it turns out. Right. So let's jump into it. So first up, coming in at eighth place, is Paper Dragons by Siobhan McDermott. Now, the backstory to this one is a bit funny because the store I was working at the time, I've since transferred to a different branch, but we got a bunch of copies, advanced copies, what's known as proofs in the industry, and they just turned up one day in the staff room, and I saw it just lying on the shelf, and this was like late January, so new Chinese New Year was coming up, and even though I myself don't identify as Chinese, I acknowledge that my ancestry is Chinese, and so culturally my family does celebrate Chinese New Year. And when I saw this, I thought, oh, it's coming up Chinese New Year. Oh, that's nice, and etc. And after like the second day, I was talking to like some of my other colleagues about Chinese New Year, and they point out, oh yeah, there's that book on the proof on the shelf. Like, what? Have you read it? And I said no. Like, I took a look at it. I was like, oh, it's a children's book. I don't normally read children's books, like, not anymore. Which I have now since been trying to change this year. Like, this was the first. Having finished this, I've since read 2 to 3 more other children's books this year, and I've enjoyed them quite a bit, despite not being a child. So the first lesson, for the reason this comes in at eighth place, is it reminded me of a very important lesson, which is that you're never too old for a children's book. Like, even though it's called a children's book, I think they would still be enjoyable for adults. So, if you're browsing your local bookstore next time, wander through the kids section. Like, why not? Maybe something catches your eye. But yeah, I was like, oh, okay, I don't really read kids' books, but I might as well give it a try. Like, and I made a joke about how, like, oh, I'm racially obligated as one of like the 3 Asian people working in this store to read this. So yeah, I picked it up, started going through it, and about a third of the way through, I went back to the blurb and was like, wait a minute, like, we're a Harry Potter-esque journey, and a third of the way through, like, we'd only just gotten into Hogwarts, the equivalent of a third of the way into the book. So I was like, wait, what's going on here? So I just plowed through it, and at the end of it, it ends on a cliffhanger. That's when I realized, like, oh, this is the first of a series. But something that I like the way this does the series compared to Harry Potter or like Percy Jackson or whatever, or even like Alex Rider, which is a series that I loved as a kid, is that there's because the first book ends on a cliffhanger, the entire plot, the entire arc is one major thing. Like, all the issues I have with kids' books previously that I've read, at least, Series of Unfortunate Events, Alex Rider, Harry Potter, Percy Jackson, Ian Coulter, even each book, or there's no plot that spans more than 2 to 3 books, right? Like each sort of arc, kind of like manga, like each volume is its own contained thing, and because of that, I find it you find it hard to like stay invested in and you dive in and out. Some people find that an advantage, which is fine, but for me, I much prefer having a scenario where it's like, okay, I'm in it for the whole long series, which I think adult fantasy does really, really well. There's like 3 to 4 books just about this one story, this one topic. So that's the first thing that I really gave it points for. And then when I got over that, okay, this is the first of the series, I then went back and read it again with a slightly different attitude, a slightly different outlook on it, and trying to pay a bit more attention to the story, what was going on, and I really, really enjoyed like all the like hidden layers and like subtle extra things to it. Like for example, the first entire section of this book, and even the character, she feels out of place. She feels like she doesn't belong, and that really resonated with my childhood. I was the one Asian kid in my entire school for the longest time. During my younger years, like single digit ages, and it wasn't until I became like a teenager and learned to shut the hell up and act normally around people that things started to work out for me. But that really resonated with me as well, and just the way the author presents all of these like interesting concepts. She has this really good juggle between world building and actual like moving the plot forward. And something that I didn't love is that there were times when it felt like she was world building for the sake of world building and moving plot forward for the sake of moving plot forward. I think in an ideal scenario, the world building should move the plot forward, or moving the plot forward should also build the world. And this book does it does that. It just doesn't do it all the time perfectly. So that's why I really loved it. It's been my favorite children's book I've read this year, but it's definitely not in like the top 5 or whatever. I think it's still amazing. I'm still invested in it. I'm still waiting for part 2 to come out, which I think is sometime in 2025. So I am looking forward to that. I think, like I said earlier, I think people should be reading more children's books. I think if you did want to read some good children's books, there are, I think, probably better, more accessible titles I could recommend. Feel free to let me know. I'm happy to discuss that in the comments. But for me, between hitting home on my childhood and being able to help me get over that dislike of series I have, I'm a big fan of reading standalone books that are self-contained. I find it very hard to stay invested in a multiple part series, but I was surprisingly invested in this. So I think those points, the fact that it helped me get over my dislike of series and everything else I've just said, is why it does make my top 8. Coming in at number 7, we are moving more towards one of my main genres, and I think the genre that most of the people watching this as card game enjoyers will probably enjoy, which is sci-fi and fantasy. So this one, I received this as part of a shortlist for a prize that my bookstore was running, and yeah, I started reading through this, and I was looking forward to it from the beginning because it wasn't on my initial shortlist, but I saw the title, I saw the synopsis, the brief description, and I thought, wow, that sounds really interesting. That sounds like my kind of book. So I requested it and received it. And it was everything I wanted it to be. So the premise is that it's an apocalyptic, well, it leans more towards fantasy than sci-fi, but it is slightly dystopian. So it's a world where Russia basically suffered a nuclear fallout for whatever reason, be it losing the Cold War or what have you, in a world where the Trans-Siberian Railway still exists. Except obviously to deal with this nuclear wasteland, title Wasteland, they had to make the Trans-Siberian Railway a absolute monster of a machine. Almost like a tank of a train. So that's the basic premise. So the idea is that there are a few different characters, I think 3 main characters the book follows, and it documents these characters' journey aboard what is unknown to anyone, the last journey of this train. And their backstories and their motivations all are very nicely established. But what I love is that as you flick back and forth between each character's perspective and stories, you get this like sense that something's not quite right. That there's like it's almost like the train itself is a fourth character in this story and is present in all three of the other characters' like plot lines. So as their stories start to intertwine and things start to happen, and trying not to spoil this, but as shit starts to hit the fan, basically, it starts devolving from this standard like eerie, almost horror like fantasy into more of this like sort of philosophical like the meaning of life, which as we all know is a key cornerstone of the fantasy and sci-fi genres. And the way like the author executes this shift of tone from we don't know what's going on, revealing bit by bit, and suddenly everything comes out and you're having to like jump like process everything. That's a writing element that I really, really, really love. And like I said with Paper Dragons, is that sort of weird combination of having the plot line, the story advance the world building, and the world building advance the story, and this absolutely does that the whole way through. I don't think it's for everyone. Like, there's no romance in it. The action is very unsettling. It's much more like an atmospheric fantasy than anything else, but it's one of those ones where, just like a train, like, it just kept going, and I was just along for the ride and just didn't want to get off. So, yeah, definitely number 7. I kind of wanted to put it a bit higher, actually, but a lot of these other ones that I'm coming to talk about next, especially in order, just to me had enough like of that special, that secret something, like that X factor that just put them a head and shoulder above. Like, the only real criticism I have about this is that at no point does it feel unique or special or anything like that. It is just a through and through good book. Whereas everything else I'm about to talk about really has something special to it. So, number 6 is Glorious Exploits by Ferdia Lennon. Oh, I forgot to mention. Cautious Traveler's Guide to the Wastelands is by Sarah Brooke, as you can see on the cover. I will have details about all these books down in the description if you want to find out more. So yeah, Glorious Exploits by Ferdia Lennon. It's very likely that if you buy a copy now, your one will have a very different cover to mine. Again, this was part of the same prize-winning shortlist as this, and this actually ended up winning the debut fiction prize, which is very nice. It was probably one of my 2 votes. I believe I put this at 2nd or 3rd in my ballot to win the prize. The premise is it's an ancient Greek historic fiction. And the pitch, or the tagline I always give people when I'm selling this book in store is, when you think historic Greek fiction, you think of epics like the Iliad, the Odyssey, things like that, which, they're great pieces of literature, don't get me wrong. But they're very, like, lofty, they're very epic. It's all about these heroes on these great journeys, doing great things, and for someone who reads a lot of fantasy and sci-fi, I get enough of that already. And what this does as a piece of contemporary historic fiction is it throws that out the window. It's like, the line I like to give is that it's like Bill and Ted or Monty Python in ancient Greece. It's about these 2 guys being guys. Like, it's sweary, it's crude, it's very, not rough, but it's very upfront about what it's trying to do and what it's trying to tell you. There's no like deeper meaning, there's no like social commentary, there's no like multiple levels to it. It's just a fun little adventure that makes you laugh, makes you cry maybe sometimes, and just like leaves you feeling that weird mix of bittersweet and heartwarming. Because it's one thing that I like is that it does draw upon its Greek influences, and it is a tragedy, but it's also comedic. I wouldn't go as far as to call it a straight dramedy like Shakespeare's works, but there are tragic elements throughout the entire thing. But it's not, I wouldn't call it drama. It's almost like a sitcom episode, just a little bit more drawn out in the way it approaches things. But it's just such a breath of fresh air to, like, the cozy crimes written by celebrities, or the reimagining or retelling of Greek myths that has dominated the book industry for the last like few years. It was just down to earth. What you see is what you get, and it was just fun all the way through. So that's definitely why it's number 6. Moving on to number 4, we have what is easily the largest tome in this list. We've got The Bright Sword by Lev Grossman. Now, avid readers amongst you might recognize this name. He is the author of the Magicians trilogy, which I also really, really enjoyed. And you can sort of see that the cover looks almost the same as the covers for the Magicians. I am a fan of Arthurian legend. I don't know if I've ever publicized that or told lots of people. I don't know if it's common knowledge even between my friends, but I was a fan of Arthurian legend even before the Fate series got popular. Let me say that right here, right now. So, when I was 11 or 12, I read Once and Future King. When I was 13, 14, I read the original Mort d'Arthur, the original work. So, for me, Arthurian Legend is one of those ones that, no matter what it is, I will bite. There was a young adult book published this year, I think, as well, called, I don't know the characters, but, basically, Guinevere and Arthur, aren't in love, and it's about how Queen Guinevere is secretly a lesbian and Arthur's secretly gay for Bedivere, and it's, your classic teen queer love story, which definitely isn't my regular cup of tea. It's not something that I usually tend to read, but I read it anyway. I didn't enjoy it, but I acknowledged that it was a decent book, and I could definitely see why younger adults, teenagers would have liked it. I've even recommended it and sold it a few times this year, but the fact is, you put Camelot, Excalibur, whatever in a book, I will read it. So this one, when I saw it come up on my newsletter for publisher proofs, advanced copies, I basically wrote a paragraph to the publisher about what I just said, saying I love Arthurian legend, please, please, please let me read this. And while waiting for it to arrive, I demolished the entirety of the Magicians trilogy in the meantime. I actually hadn't read it until earlier this year. But what I like about Lev Grossman's work is that he, again, does that thing where the world building doesn't push the story, but he's just so good at world building that I'm willing to forgive that. You just get lost in those worlds. And even a well-established universe like Arthurian legend, this is not factual, accurate to the original Arthurian legend in any way whatsoever, and I can forgive that. I'm totally okay with you subverting or twisting the facts or changing the story as long as the result is worthwhile. And the result here is definitely worthwhile. What I especially love about this one is that the reason it's such a massive book, not just because there's a lot going on, but because he intersperses chapters every now and again in between the main plot line about flashbacks, of side characters, things that are literal exposition chapters that almost serve zero purpose of the plot line, but just give us so much more information and understanding about all, the variety of characters in Arthurian legend that we've come to know and love. And he does so in a way that, again, changes the original story in a way that just makes it a bit more engrossing and a bit more enthralling, which I really, really enjoy. The first flashback chapter, I was kind of but then by the second and third ones, I was like, yep, this is great. I'm now invested in these characters. Tell me more about Bedivere. Tell me more about Dinadan. It reaches the point, towards the end, where people start dying, and I was like, oh my god, they finally, I can't believe he actually killed them. In the first half, he was teasing, oh, will they, won't they, what's gonna happen? And by the, at that point, you're like, ooh, you kind of don't care, because they're just whatever. And then once you get past all that, you're like, okay, now I care. The only real criticisms I have of this one is that it's gigantically massive. It's what, 600, just a little bit under 700 pages, which, this was the longest book it took me. This took me nearly 2 weeks to finish. But that was also because I really took my time to really savor and enjoy it, all the moments of it. You can tell how bent up the spine is, how long I spent going next page. So that's one criticism, and the other one is there are times when, not that it jumps around too much, but there are developments in the story that sometimes feel like they diminish previous developments in the story. This is, even though I've just said that I liked Glorious Exploits because it's a subversion of the classic retelling of the Greek epic myths we have, this is in and of itself an epic. Like, it's a journey, it's an adventure, it's one guy becoming a hero against all odds. This would not, like, obviously the setting and whatnot are out of place, but I think this would not be out of place compared to the Iliad and the Odyssey, other than the fact that it's not written as poetry. But the other thing is that because of that, I kind of want to feel, I would have felt that I would have liked everything in it to have been relevant in some way. And there are some things that just completely overshadow other things. Again, I'm trying not to spoil anything for anyone here, but it's just really like, I think the fact that I spent as long as I did reading this helped to negate that impact, because by the time, like, I got to major event X, major event, like, W had already, like, was already, like, several days ago in my mind. But yeah, if you're looking for something to, like, really, really bury and lose yourself in, the fact that it was just a masterful execution of Arthurian legend is what sealed the deal for me. So moving into number 4, this is now my genre specialty. So we don't have, like, titles in my store. We're all just booksellers. Some of us have, like, more knowledge in some fields than others. Like, for example, my knowledge of, like, the history and the business section is rock bottom zero. But when it comes to Japanese literature, I would go as far as to say that I'm better than the rest of my colleagues combined. So Japanese literature has really taken off in the last year and a half, and I primarily would say the number one book to thank for that would have been Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi, which, again, is a series that I loved, but it's not like... I'd say it's great because it's groundbreaking. I wouldn't say it's groundbreaking because it's great. Like, there are advantages. There's things that series does really, really well that many, many other authors have piggybacked on, have, spun varieties of. But the idea of, like, short, light, easy novels composing of multiple chapters about unrelated people, but there's this one, like, common thing that helps them fix all their problems. This is a trope that's been existing in Japan for a long, long, long time. Like, some of them are fantasy, some of them are just grounded in the real world. It doesn't matter. The fact is, any book that's, like, not too heavy, and where each chapter is about some different person tackling their problems, like, straight off the bat, I can tell you, Full Moon Coffee Shop, Days at the not Days at the Bookstore, What You're Looking For Is in the Library, Kamigawa Food Detectives, Lantern of Lost Memories, Will Prescribe You a Cat. Like, these are just 5 of the ones I've read this year. And there are some from last year that I haven't read. There's some coming out next year that I'm going to read. The fact is, the idea of massive, massive collections of short chapters about people is a mainstay. So when I picked this up, I picked it up because it was another one that I felt obligated to read as the Japanese literature expert in the shop. And I was surprisingly impressed, because something that all the other books do, Before the Coffee Gets Cold, Days at the Morisaki Bookstore, even like Genzaburo Yoshino's How Do You Live, these are all... It's hard to describe. Like, a lot of Japanese books have this poignancy. I don't know if that's a real word, if I've used that correctly, but there's that sort of melancholic vibe to them about how you get to experience life through another person's eyes, but there's no, like, big mind, like, life-changing revelation. There's no, like, pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. It's, you've walked a mile in someone else's shoes, and all that's happened is you've walked a mile in someone else's shoes. Especially, like, my biggest criticism of Before the Coffee Gets Cold series in particular is that you don't come out the other end a better person for it. You don't even come out the other end a different person for it. It's almost like every chapter of these sorts of books are filler episodes in the story that is your life, if that makes sense. And the reason I put this on my top 8 list is because it almost acknowledges that fact. It almost embraces the fact that it's not going to, like, change your life. It's not going to, like, open up a third eye or whatever. All it does, it just makes you feel good for, like, 20 to 30 minutes after each chapter. And that's fine. That's all it needed to do. Another thing I also, well, I don't want to say complain about, but Before the Coffee Gets Cold, Will Prescribe You a Cat, and the Full Moon coffee shop. Something I didn't like about those ones is that there was this strong element of like ethereal, like almost fantasy mysticism about them, which compared to like say I don't know what you're looking for is in the library, it's just normal people in the normal world, which this does as well. The title is a mouthful, but it just grounds us in, it's not menial, but the ordinary everyday. Like finding beauty in the ordinary everyday, I think is such a Japanese lesson. And the fact that like the poem, not poems, like it's hard to describe. Like it's got this like lyrical factor to it, like this poetic justice or poetic like karma that this book tries to frame the world in is what makes it so comfortable and enjoying. And it's why I put it on this list, because every chapter I couldn't like sympathize or resonate with any of these characters in any of the chapters at all. And that's what made it good. That's what made it feel like a proper like experience where like one of the reasons we read as a species is to create worlds and imagine emotions that we wouldn't normally feel and imagine otherwise, which is why having such that departure, I think, really makes such a big difference. And another thing that this book does really, really well, that I've only ever seen one other Japanese short book do, which is Full Moon Coffee Shop, Will Prescribe Your Cat is the one, is that the common thread that ties all of them together, all the chapters, all the people, the book actually cares about it. It's not like, for example, in The Lantern of Lost Memories, which I also read this year, there's only 3 chapters, and the mystical aspect, the problem solver in all of those chapters really comes becomes a main character in and of himself, which I think is pushing it a little bit too far. Then you're losing the point of different chapters that are unrelated, unconnected. Whereas this one, all the chapters, all the characters really are unconnected, but you get to look behind the stationery shop. You get to look at the guy who runs it, his life. And again, it's almost like with Curious Cautious Traveler's Guide to the Wastelands. The stationery shop itself almost takes on a life of its own and almost becomes a character in and of itself, but it doesn't. That's the important thing. There's that level of like, okay, a little bit more. It teases like a line here and there, but it never distracts from the core point, which is that you read one chapter and it's almost like taking like a shot of something. Like it makes you feel good for a bit, and then you don't have to worry about it again. And the fact that like I could just come back to this book, choose one of like the 5 chapters or 4 chapters at any point, and just feel like, okay, like that was good. I'm done now. Like that is what I think puts this heads and shoulders above Before the Coffee Gets Cold or anything else like that. Right. Moving on now to an actual sci-fi. This came out last year. In fact, the 2nd and 3rd place, both are 2023 books, but I've only just read this year. So The Deep Sky by Yume Kitasei. She is an American-born Japanese, so this technically doesn't count as Japanese literature. This is just straight up normal Western sci-fi. And it is a traditional sci-fi in nearly every sense of the word. It's more like a sci-fi thriller. So the premise is that the Earth, it's a future where humans have developed effectively interstellar technology, but not regularly. Like this is the maiden voyage of a rocket ship that is going to travel several hundred light years into like the unknown galaxy to find a new inhabitable planet to replace the dying Earth. And I say replace, I mean literally replace. Like the only people on this ship are like a handful of female astronauts who are being artificially inseminated in the ship and will then give birth in the ship, and their kids are going to be the ones to repopulate the new planet that they find. That's the premise. Like that's already like apocalyptic, like crazy speculative apocalyptic like levels of sci-fi to start with. But that's not the point of the book. The point of this book is that while they're on this journey, a bomb goes off and it kills some of the crew and obviously causes problems. So you have this sci-fi backdrop built in and sort of like nesting this locked room murder mystery. And I said earlier that the trope of like celebrities in the UK writing murder mystery novels is one that I'm getting bored of. That doesn't mean I don't like murder mysteries. Like I'm okay with them every now and again. There are some that are really good. There are also some that are really bad, and I've read both ends of the spectrum. But the thing I liked about this is that it doesn't focus on being a murder mystery. If anything, the fact that there's a locked room murder is the vehicle with which the plot points and the commentary points ride on, which I think is it's not something that I've ever seen done before, because the main character, just like the author, is an American born Japanese. And she talks a lot in this book about the sort of clash between different cultures and belonging, which you'll notice is a trope that I really like because of how I like Paper Dragons. So again, I have resonated with this really well. Like, I'm not an American born Japanese, but I am an Asian guy born and grew up in the UK. So even though I look the way I do, I sound the way I do. And if I had to, I once said to my colleagues in the break room one day that I'm probably the whitest person in this room more than anyone else combined. And I stand by that fact. Like, I call myself British. I don't call myself Asian unless calling myself Asian benefits me in some way, shape, or form. Like, I actively dislike when people come into my store and speak like any Asian language at me. Like, if I notice that someone is struggling with something and then they're struggling in English, then I'll transition to like Japanese, Korean, Thai, based on who they are. I don't speak Vietnamese, I don't speak Chinese. And it's there are some customers, there are some regulars who speak to me in Thai, but because they're regulars, like we know it, we know each other, that's okay. It's just one of those ones where like to me, being Asian is for the longest time was something that I considered a drawback rather than an advantage. And it was only like when I was like, what, 17, 18, going into university that I had like this social, like, internal awakening, like this change of mindset. But I'm not trying to talk about my past. Like, the point is that the balance of culture and society is one of the many things that this book talks about, which I really, really liked. And one thing as well that the book does incredibly well is the author inserts multiple different flashbacks throughout the entire book, and they are all relevant in some way, shape, or form. Because throughout the entire book, we have the main character's point of view, and we're in her head the whole time. And these flashbacks really, really help us like get into the shoes and the body of this character. Like, what makes her tick? Why does she think the way she does? Why does she behave the way she does? All of these things put together. There's also elements of like misleading as well. Because you're so in her head, like you're following this character so much, you don't think about the murder mystery the way you would about any other book. Like when I'm reading, Richard Osman or like whatever other like Agatha Christie, I'm always thinking about, okay, that's the crime. What have these characters said so far? How have these people behaved? Who could it have been? Like what? Like you're thinking about the case. Whereas with this one, because your head is so full of the character and like her circumstances and all of this, you don't have time to think about the crime. That's why when the reveal comes, it's such a gut punch, and it's like the misleads and like the obfuscations and like all the subversions, they just come together so well. And there's no like, to really cap it all off, there's no like happy ending about like, oh, like bright hopes towards the future that is so common in sci-fi. It sort of ends on a note that makes that you have to like think for yourself, like, how does it actually end? Like, do they make it to this new planet? Like, do they like, do the kids grow up fine? Like all of these things. Because to me, those aren't the important questions to answer. The important questions to answer throughout this book are things like, can you really trust what you see? How do you judge people based on like how they're acting or what they're saying? And the way this book analyzes that is what really like, it really stuck to me to the point where of the 8 books in this top 8 list, this is one of only 3 that I'm actually giving out to friends for Christmas. The rest I've all enjoyed, but I don't think they would make as generically good gifts. Whereas this one is just straight up, enjoyable for people who like sci-fi, enjoyable for people who like murder mysteries. It's got a little bit of everything, all wrapped up in that sort of socio-ethnic conversation, which, given who I gave this to, I think would also appreciate. So yeah, that's number 3. Moving on to number 2. So yeah, again, this came out last year, but I've only read it this year because I think it's only been translated this year. I could be wrong. But this is First Love by Ryo Shimamoto. And God, where do I begin? So I would say one of the keystone books of 2024 has been Butter by Asako Yuzuki. Now, I read that book. I liked it. It was a good book. It has won a lot of prizes, well deserved, I think. It's been selling really well. It's really easy to pitch to people. People have just been picking it up. But what I find interesting is that I've gotten a handful of people saying like, "Oh, I read it and I didn't love it." Some people like a lot of people really loved it, which is great. But a lot of people are like, "This wasn't really the book for me," and I understand totally why. Because again, Butter's trying to do a lot of different things all at once, and it does them all adequately, but it doesn't do that one thing really, really well. So, First Love is very, very similar in premise to that book. It is a psychological thriller about this clinical psychologist who has to analyze a young woman who's murdered her father and figure out why. That's the top level explanation I'd give. There's a lot more going on in the book that I think is relevant to the plot that I'm not going to spoil, but a lot like Butter, it focuses on the why of the murder, not the how of the murder. Really getting to like the mindset and the psyche of these characters. And a lot like Butter, there is quite some powerful like social commentary and observation, especially themes of young romance, parental neglect and abuse. There's a few other things as well that I don't want to like get into because of again minor spoilers, but there's a lot of like dynamic here that the revelations that are made throughout the book, none of them were, I'd say, immensely shocking or like oh my god, I didn't see that coming. A lot of them were just like you knew that something along these lines was going to go down, but you just weren't ready for the impact that even though you knew what was going to happen, you could just not be ready for the impact that the book would imply to you, is how I would describe it. And because of that, I think the balance between, I guess, action is the wrong word, but things that drive the plot in this book definitely take a second seat. Like, the basic plot itself could easily have been resolved in like 10 pages. Because that's the point of, a thriller. Like, it's not about what happens, it's about why they happen and, how the people think. And that's what I really like about this as a psychological thriller. It really, you don't get straight into the mind of the characters, but the way the characters think definitely leaves an impact on the way you think. And it's sort of, it's like reverse like therapy, if that makes sense. You go to therapy, you talk about your problems, someone says, oh, like, and they like a therapist helps you work through what you're feeling and what you're thinking. Whereas this, you need to like help this book about what it's thinking and feeling, if that makes sense. It's all about you're borrowing these emotions and this mindset, and you're trying to like find your own solution, and then maybe like pass it back to the book and be like, well, what about this? What about that? And then the characters obviously can't listen to you because the book's already been written. But just that idea of like, you having to ask the book, like, wait, does this mean? Wait, does that mean? And like trying to find your own answers from there. This just really, really powerful writing. I was, by the time I finished this book, I was like, wow, that was so good. I'm so glad I read this, which is honestly a feeling that I don't get very often. Like, usually I get those feelings as I'm reading the book, but this one really saves it all to the end. So that's number 2, First Love, Ryo Shimamoto. This, I would say, of the 8 books here, this is the one I would recommend to any sort of contemporary fiction reader. This is, if you're not into sci-fi, you're not into fantasy, this is the book to pick up. I'm just so sad that there's not more like, there's like no reviews for it online. Like, people don't even know about it, and it's kind of sad because like a lot of Japanese literature falls by the wayside in that way. Like, this won a prize in Japan, as you can see on the back. Like, it's pretty major, and I think it's because the author and the translator are both not that well known. it hasn't really picked up much attention, and I guess you could say it's been overshadowed by Butter a little bit, but I think, honestly, even if you dislike Butter, you should read this, and if you like Butter, you should definitely read this. So please read this, if anything else. This is the takeaway recommendation from this video, despite it only being second place. So, I'm sure you're all wondering what first place is, given that I've just talked so much about that. First place is a book that I would say has probably been the most life-changing book for me this year. And I don't think it's the best book I've read this year, but it's the one that I've really taken to the most, because it's really sort of reframed like a lot of how I think about life, a lot about how I think about the world, which to me is a good sign of sci-fi, right? Sci-fi is where we ask all these big psychological questions, where we sort of reevaluate our place in the universe, our lives, and all of that. And the book that does that is Toward Eternity by Anton He. Anton He is a name that some of you might know because he translates a lot of other Korean literature, but this is a fully written by him in English, original, speculative sci-fi. Now, where to begin? I'm going to start by linking, where I talk about this book down in the description. I will link the review I left for this book to already encapsulates so much of what I feel towards this book. But without spoiling anything, without going into the details, without repeating anything I've said in that review, this is one of those books that really takes an approach that you never would have thought about, which is combining poetry and literature with sci-fi, and asking questions that have been asked before, but in a new way that really makes you stop and think. Like the fact that there's different characters with different viewpoints, the fact that it jumps around between time, the fact that nearly everything this book talks about is sort of ethereal. Nothing is permanent, nothing matters. It's all about the big questions. That is what I think a real sci-fi should do. It should surprise no one that another of my all-time favorites is Adrian Tchaikovsky, Children of Time, Lords of Uncreation, all of those. And this really follows that niche in such a perfect way. But what this does better than Adrian Tchaikovsky is that while he's really good at that sort of atmospheric environmentalism while asking the big philosophical questions, this is just all in on philosophy. This is just who are you? Why do you matter? Why does what you do matter? Do you remember anything? Every few pages, I had to close the book and be let me think about what I just read, which is not something that I do very often, if at all. It was just words chilling and beautiful, haunting. There are so many adjectives. I'm sure every single adjective in the English language could be applied to this book in some way, shape, or form, and it would still be valid in some way. It's just, I don't want to say smart because that feels really diminutive, but it feels very academic or thought-provoking. It's just one of those ones about, it's like if you took all three different trains of three different genres, one about society, one about true sci-fi, and one about poetry and whatever, and you just crash them all together. And it's like watching three trains crash in slow motion and seeing all the patterns, all the fire, all the debris, and taking a photo of that and saying that this is art. That's the best way I can describe this. It's I'm just trying to think about words. This is the issue. I haven't written a script. I've ad-libbed everything I've just said about these 8 books, and this one's been the hardest one to do because there's just so much I want to say and I just don't know how to say it properly. But this was easily my book of 2024. Actually life-changing. I've recommended to 3 or 4 friends already. They've enjoyed it. It's just one of those ones where everyone takes away something different based on what you're looking for. And the fact that a book can do that, I think, is a sign of really good writing and just really, really clever both plot, idea, and execution. So yeah, props to Anton He. Please write more. I'm looking forward to whatever comes out next. But this is just, in every way, like, this might be one of my favorite books of all time. That's just all I can say about it. Like, that's it. So yeah, those have been my top 8 books of 2024. Thank you very much for listening to me talk about a niche passion of mine for close to an hour, well over the 30 minutes I promised. But yeah, again, if you always want to talk about books, my job is a bookseller. I'd love to talk about books. And I am probably going to try and read even more in 2025, and hopefully you'll see one of these next year as well. But until then, that's going to be it for now. Hope you all have a very lovely new year. See you in 2025. Take care. Peace.